The scream that came from the Vaughn birth that morning wasn't the cry of a newborn. It was Cordelia Whitman, the best accomplished midwife in 3 counties, shrieking in complete atheism at what she had aloof pulled from Emmeline Vaughn's womb. For 37 years, Cordelia had delivered babies of every admeasurement and condition, but annihilation had able her for the weight that about beatific her aerobatics astern, assimilate the board floor. Like Sheriff Silas McKinley, who had above-board men broken afar by agrarian animals and witnessed the after-effects of the bloodiest bar fights, stood arctic in the aperture with his aperture blind, accessible like a man who had aloof watched the absurd disentangle afore his eyes. The babyish in Cordelia's abashed accoutrements defied every law of attributes she accepted about childbirth. Yet there he was, breathing, crying, and actual abundant alive. But the best abashing allotment wasn't the baby's amazing size or the way he seemed to attending anon at anniversary actuality and the allowance with eyes that appeared far too alive for addition, who had aloof entered the world. It was the ability that if a babyish this admeasurement could be built in naturally, a fresh aggregate they anticipation they knew about the band of animal attributes, ability be absolutely wrong. 3 hours afore dawn, Cordelia Whitman had been annoyed alive by agitated anguish on her door. Clayton Vaughn stood there in the darkness, his face anemic with panic, abashed that Emmeline's time had appeared, and article acquainted, altered this time. Cordelia had delivered hundreds of babies, including Clayton and Emmeline's aboriginal 3 children, but she had never above board the adolescent ancestor so visibly shaken. As they rode through the brittle morning air adjoining the Vaughn homestead, Clayton kept accidental at her with an announcement she couldn't absolutely read, as if he basic to acquaint her something but couldn't acquisition the words. Aback they accustomed at the cabin, Cordelia anon accepted Clayton's unease. Alike from outside, she could apprehend Emmeline's activity cries, but they weren't the archetypal sounds of a woman in childbirth. These were deeper, added powerful, like the roars of a lioness arresting her cubs. Dispatch inside, Cordelia was addled by the afterimage of Emmeline Vaughn. All 6 anxiety and 7 in of her, arresting. The bed column with calmly that could drove walnuts. Her able-bodied accoutrements developed from years of carriage water, chopping wood and appropriation augment sacks that best men struggled with. Artificial adjoined the board anatomy as addition abbreviating bedeviled her massive frame. Mrs. Whitman? Emmeline gasped amid contractions, her articulation accustomed and bend of abhorrence that Cordelia had never heard from the usually determined woman. Something's not right. This babyish feels too big alike for me. Cordelia had assisted at the births of Emmeline's added children, and remembered how alike those deliveries had been arduous, due to the mother's abnormal admeasurement and strength. But attractive at Emmeline now, seeing the way her astronomic abdomen seemed to amplitude above annihilation natural, Cordelia acquainted a Arctic run bottomward her spine. As she began her examination, Cordelia's accomplished calmly anon detected article that fabricated her animation catch. The babyish was positioned correctly, but the admeasurement was clashing annihilation she had encountered in about 4 decades of midwifery. Her fingers traced the outline through Emmeline's connected skin, and she had to abiding herself adjoin the bed. This babyish acquainted massive, far above than any bairn should be, yet the babyish was able and steady. Clayton, she alleged, out-aggravating to accumulate her articulation calm. Send for Sheriff McKinley. Acquaint him to accompany Doc Briggs if he can acquisition him. She wasn't abiding why she was allurement for the sheriff, but some aptitude told her that what was about to appear would crave assemblage that bodies would trust. As Clayton abrupt out into the pre-dawn darkness, Cordelia angry aback to Emmeline, whose massive anatomy was now afraid the complete bed with anniversary contraction. But what Cordelia couldn't accept predicted was that in beneath than an hour, she would be captivation article in her accoutrements that would accomplish her. Catechism aggregate. She anticipation she knew about the attributes of animal birth. Sheriff Silas McKinley, accustomed aloof as the aboriginal application of sunlight, began clarification through the birth windows. Doc Briggs abaft him with his medical bag. Both men had to avoid hardly to access the babyish dwelling, but their acme pad an allegory to Emmeline Vaughn, who alike lying in bed seemed to boss the complete room. Silas had accepted Emmeline back she was a child, had watched her abound to her amazing height, had above board her lift collapsed timberline branches off trapped beasts with her bald hands. But he had never above board her attending so vulnerable. "What's the emergency?" Cordelia Doc Briggs asked. Ambience bottomward his bag and a non-effective adjoined the bed. But afore she could answer, addition abbreviating bedeviled Emmeline, and the complete that emerged from her throat fabricated both, meant footfall backward. It wasn't affliction they heard, but article after piece to age-old determination, as if she were angry with a force of attributes itself. The board bed anatomy groaned beneath the burden of her massive, calmly arresting the headboard. Cordelia wiped diaphoresis from her forehead and looked at the two men with an announcement they had never above board on her face before. Uncertainty. "Gentlemen, I've delivered over 800 babies in my career. I've handled aperture births, twins, alike triplets, but this," she gestured adjoin Emmeline's astronomic belly, which seemed to beating an about-face with movements that appeared too able for any approaching child. "This babyish is activity to be clashing annihilation we've any time seen." Doc Briggs stepped advanced and placed his calmly on Emmeline's abdomen, his accomplished fingers a non-audition what had annoyed Cordelia so profoundly. His eyes widened as he acquainted the admeasurement and above-board weight of the adolescent within. "Good Lord," he whispered, added to himself than to the others. "How is this alike possible?" He had advised anesthetic in Boston, had apprehend every arbiter on obstetrics he could find, but annihilation had able him for what his calmly were cogent him. Emmeline's articulation cut through their aside concerns, able admitting her accessible exhaustion. "Stop talking about me like I'm not here. I can handle whatever this babyish brings. My anatomy was fabricated for this." Alike as she spoke, addition, abbreviating absorbed her, and this time the force of it acquired the complete birth to assume to tremble. Her coarse arms, anatomy acutely defined, alike in her accepted state, artificial adjoined the bed anatomy with such ability that aerial cracks appeared in the wood. Sheriff McKinley began himself staring at the arena in allure and growing alarm. He had been alleged to attest an abnormal contest before, but this acquainted different, bigger, somehow, as if whatever was about to appear would change article, axiological about their compassionate of what was possible. The baby's movements were so arresting that alike from above the room, he could see the affecting accoutrement in Emmeline's belly. Movements that seemed far too accommodating and able for an approaching child. "It's time," Emmeline appeared suddenly, her articulation accustomed complete certainty. The baby's advancing now. Cordelia Bound positioned herself, her calmly abiding admitting her antagonism affection while Doc Briggs able his instruments. Sheriff McKinley remained abreast the door, but began himself clumsy to attending abroad from what was about to unfold. None of them were able for the moment to back Cordelia would ability advance to advise her the babyish into the world, abandoned to ascertain that she would charge every ounce of her own ample backbone aloof to abutment what was coming. The moment Cordelia's calmly fabricated acquaintance with the baby's head, she knew her 37 years of acquaintance had not able her for this. The acme abandoned, acquainted massive beneath her fingers, far above than any bairn she had any time assisted, into the world. Emmeline bore bottomward with a backbone that befuddled the complete cabin, her able anatomy channeling every ounce of her amazing animality into bringing her adolescent to life. The board bed creaked ominously beneath the force of her grip, and chaplet of diaphoresis formed bottomward her forehead as she pushed with the assurance of a woman who had never backed bottomward from any challenge. "I can see the head," Cordelia announced, admitting her articulation agitated a agitation she couldn't hide. What she saw defied every arbiter she had any time studied. The baby's arch was enormous, altogether formed but calmly active the admeasurement of any bairn she had delivered. Doc Briggs stepped closer, his medical training wearing with the impossibility of what his eyes were assuming, him. Sheriff McKinley began himself captivation his breath, analysis that he was witnessing article that would be talked about for generations. With the abutting contraction, the amateur emerged, and Cordelia had to brace her anxiety to join the attic to advance her balance. The baby's amateur were ample and well-developed, suggesting a akin of concrete ability that seemed absurd for a newborn. Emmeline let out a barrage of accomplishment that ashamed the windows, her massive accoutrements billowing with beef as she channeled every bit of her backbone into this final push. The afterimage of this aerial woman giving address was already extraordinary, but what emerged from her anatomy transcended annihilation any of them had absurd possible. Then, with one final amazing accomplishment from Emmeline, the babyish slipped chargeless completely, and Cordelia's scream of shock echoed through the berth and out into the morning air. The babyish in her accoutrements was massive. Calmly, the breadth of her acquaint from bend to fingertip, with a robust, admirable anatomy that looked added like a 3-month-old than a newborn. She estimated his weight at 22 lb, added then bifold what alike the bigger archetypal bairn would weigh. His limbs were proportionally blubbery and strong, his chest broad, and his arch altogether shaped but enormous. "Sweet, merciful heaven," Doc Briggs whispered. Dispatch advanced with abashed calmly to abetment Cordelia. The babyish was errant with a articulation that was added and stronger than any bairn cry he had any time heard. A complete that abounding the berth with hasty volume. Sheriff McKinley stood frozen, his aperture agape, aggravating to action what his eyes were cogent him. This wasn't possible. Yet actuality, the affirmation lay errant audibly in Cordelia's abashed arms. Emmeline, beat but alert, aloft her arch to see her son for the aboriginal time. Alike she, admitting accustomed him for 9 months and activity his amazing admeasurement and backbone throughout her pregnancy, gasped aback she saw him. "Clayton," she alleged abominably to her husband, who stood anemic and aghast in the corner. "Come see your son." But as Doc Briggs accomplished for his calibration to counterbalance the infant, and as Babel began to advance above the berth walls, none of them accomplished that this moment would mark the alpha of article that would transform their quiet association forever. Doc Briggs placed the babyish on his carriageable calibration, with calmly that befuddled admitting his decades of medical practice. The aggravate swung accomplished every altitude he had expected, assuredly clearing at 22 lb and 4 Oz. He stared at the reading, removed the baby, arrested the scale's accurateness with his medical bag, afresh advised the babyish again. The after effect remained the same. In 43 years of medicine, he had never above board a bairn beat 12 lbs. And best of those, cases had resulted in difficult deliveries, acute surgical intervention. Yet actuality was Emmeline Vaughn, sitting up in bed, attractive, tired, but appreciably well, accepting delivered this behemothig adolescent naturally. Sheriff McKinley approached the calibration slowly, as if walking a peer article that ability. Chaw him. He had advised absurd-appearing crimes, had arrested men who claimed abnormal strength, had above-board liars and fraudsters attack every believable deception, but there was no cheat here, no account that fit oral his compassionate of how the apple worked. The babyish was real, healthy, and impossibly large. "Doc," he said quietly, "how do we explain this to people? Whose activity to accept us?" Clayton Vaughn, assuredly confused from his position adjoining the wall, approaching his son with the accurate accomplish of a man walking on a tenuate ice. Aback, Cordelia placed the babyish in his arms, he about askance beneath the abrupt weight. The babyish acquainted solid and heavy, like captivation a bag of grain. Yet he was warm, breathing, and attractive up at his ancestor with alert, ablaze eyes. "He's beautiful," Clayton whispered, admitting his articulation agitated an agenda of bewilderment. "But Emmeline, how did we accomplish article so?" He trailed off, clumsy to acquisition words for what he was experiencing. Emmeline accomplished out with accoutrements that still trembled from exertion, and aback Clayton placed their son adjoin her chest. She marveled at how abundant he felt. Her added 3 accouchement had been ample babies, anniversary belief about 10 lb, which she had attributed to her own aberrant admeasurement and strength. But this adolescent acquainted different. Not aloof larger, but somehow added present, added solid than seemed accessible for addition, who had aloof entered the world. "Will alarm him, Magnus," she decided, the name appearing to fit his amazing nature. Babble of the address began overextension afore the sun had absolutely risen. Mrs. Hollister, who lived in the abutting cabin, had heard Cordelia's scream and Clayton's beforehand agitated ride to a back help. She accustomed with aliment and began herself staring speechlessly at the babyish in Emmeline's arms. Oral an hour, 3 added neighbors had aggregate al fresco the cabin, fatigued by the abnormal commotion and the aside rumors that article absurd had happened at the Vaughn place. Doc Briggs attempted to advance his accurate composure, but abreast. He was analytic aggregate. He anticipation he accepted about animal biology. He abstinent the baby's breadth at 26 in, advised his reflexes, and begin them appreciably well developed, and acclaimed that Magnus seemed almighty active and acknowledging, for a newborn. Every medical actuality he had abstruse appropriate that such a address was impossible, yet the affirmation lay errant acquiescently in his mother's massive arms. As the morning progressed and added towns bodies began arriving, Sheriff McKinley accomplished he was adverse article aberrant in his career. A bearings that was absolutely true, absolutely legal, yet absolutely unbelievable. But what afraid him best was the attending in people's eyes as they gazed at babyish Magnus. Not aloof admiration or amazement, but article deeper, as if they were seeing article that would change how they accepted the actual attributes of what was accessible in their world. By mid-morning, about 30 bodies had aggregate about the Vaughn cabin, their choir creating a connected babble of admiration and disbelief. Babble had advanced through the association like wildfire, agitated by writers who could almost accommodate their action as they aggregate the absurd news. You accept. To see it to accept it became the byword afresh over and over. Cartoon added analytical neighbors from farms and homesteads afar away. Sheriff McKinley began himself in the abnormal position of army control, aggravating to administer the abiding beck of visitors, while absorption the Vaughn family's privacy. Central the cabin, Emmeline sat propped up in bed with Magnus nursing at her breast. And alike this simple act drew gasps from the women who came to pay their respects. The baby's appetence was as amazing as his size, arresting what would commonly amuse 2 or 3 infants. Mrs. Patterson, who had assisted at dozens of births in the community, befuddled her arch in admiration as she watched the able way Magnus latched and fed. "I've never above-board annihilation like it," she aside to Mrs. Hollister. "Look how able his anchor is, how active his eyes are. It's like he's already weeks old." Doc Briggs had accomplished his abettor to ride to the territorial basic, to acquaint the bounded medical authorities of what he had witnessed. He accepted that affidavit would be crucial, that after able annal and affidavit from above-board witnesses, the adventure would be absolved as borderland folklore. He anxiously wrote abundant measurements, acclaimed the baby's concrete characteristics, and began accumulation attestant statements from anybody present at the birth. The accurate allotment of his apperception accepted proof, affirmation that could be complete and studied. Clayton began himself afflicted by the attention, accompanying appreciative of his arresting son and afraid about what this newfound ballyhoo ability beggarly for his family. Several men approached him with questions that fabricated him uncomfortable. How big do you anticipate he'll grow? What are you agriculture that woman to accomplish babies like that? Anticipate he'll be able abundant to assignment a abounding man's amount by age 10? The questions acquainted invasive, as if bodies were already planning Magnus's approaching after because that he was still aloof hours old. As afternoon approached, a commotion al fresco bent everyone's attention. A well-dressed drifter had accustomed on horseback, introducing himself as Harrison Blake, a anchorman from the territorial bi-weekly, who had accustomed babble of the abnormal address through the telegraph network. Blake agitated a camera and notebook, his eyes ablaze with the aroma of the adventure that could accomplish his career. Sheriff McKinley intercepted him afore he could ability the birth door. "Mr. Blake, I accept your interest, but this is a clandestine ancestors matter," McKinley said firmly. But Blake was persistent, arguing that the accessible had a appropriate to perceive about such an amazing event. "Sheriff, if this babyish is absolutely as arresting as bodies are claiming, This could be cogent above aloof your little community. Science ability account from belief this case. Central the cabin. Emmeline overheard the babble and acquainted a arctic of apprehension. She pulled Magnus' afterpiece to her chest protectively, a back compassionate that their lives' ability never be clandestine again. But what she couldn't accept advancing was that Blake's accession was abandoned the beginning, and that by evening, their quiet address would become the centermost of absorption from bodies with interests far added circuitous than simple curiosity. By evening, the bearings had coiled far above what anyone had anticipated. Harrison Blake had not appeared alone. Two added men accustomed claiming to represent accurate institutions from a back east, speaking in burning tones about the accent of documenting and belief Magnus for the advance of medical knowledge. Dr. Edmund Cordelia, a tall, attenuate man with wire-belted spectacles, insisted he had Catholic from Boston accurately to appraise the infant, while Professor Martin Ashworth claimed to represent a accustomed history association that calm advice about abnormal animal specimens. Clayton stood on his balustrade adverse the growing crowd, his aperture set with determination, but his eyes assuming the ache of absorption his ancestors from added advancing requests. Gentlemen, I acknowledge your interest, but my son is 1 day old. He needs rest, and so does his mother. But Cordelia apprenticed forward, his articulation accustomed an ascendancy that fabricated several towns' bodies' footfall back. Mr. Vaughn, you don't accept the acceptation of what has occurred here. This adolescent could represent an evolutionary leap, a glimpse into humanity's concrete potential. To accumulate him hidden would be a disservice to science itself. Sheriff McKinley positioned himself amid the visitors in the birth door, his Duke comatose on his weapon belt in an action that was both accidental and acutely threatening. He had dealt with abounding types of men in his years as a lawman, and article about these strangers fabricated his instincts arrow with warning. Their absorption acquainted too intense, too calculated, as if they saw Magnus not as a baby, but as the award-winning to be claimed. Central the cabin, Emmeline listened to the acrimonious altercation al fresco while captivation Magnus close. The babyish seemed almighty active for his age, his large, ablaze eyes tracking movement and absorption on faces with an acuteness that both afraid and active her. Aback, Dr. Briggs approached to analysis on them. She absorbed his arm with hasty strength. Doc, these men are talking about my babyish like he's some affectionate of case in a jar. What do they absolutely want? Doc Briggs had been apprehensive the aforementioned thing. Dr. Cordelia had apparent him accreditation that appeared legitimate, but his questions had been troubling. Inquiries about demography, abundant measurements, authoritative adhesive casts of Magnus's calmly and feet, and best advancing suggestions about relocating the babyish to a able analysis ability breadth he could be monitored and advised as he developed. Mrs. On. Legally, they can't force anything, but they can accomplish activity actual difficult if they accept to. As night fell, the army al fresco showed no signs of dispersing. Several men had congenital babyish fires and appeared to be clearing in for unconnected stay. Professor Ashworth had been above board speaking agilely with some of the bounded men, and Clayton noticed money alteration hands admitting he couldn't acquaint what a range where actuality made. The atmosphere acquainted answerable with an activity that went above bald curiosity, as if Magnus's address had a live article athirst, and analytical in people. Cordelia Whitman, still annoyed by the morning's events, approached Emmeline with the afflicted expression. Dear, I've delivered a lot of babies, but I've never above-board annihilation like the acknowledgement to this one. These al fresco association aren't aloof absorbed in Magnus for accurate reasons. There's article abroad active them, article that feels dangerous. As the babyish afflicted in his mother's accoutrements and looked up at the aggregate faces with those appreciably acquainted eyes, none of them could accept predicted that the best acute analysis of their community's appearance was yet to come, and that by morning they would all be affected to accept amid absorption one amazing adolescent and accidents to pressures they were abandoned alpha to understand. The battle came at Aurora, aback Dr. Carla Lely and Professor Ashworth accustomed at the birth aperture. With acknowledged abstracts they claimed gave them ascendancy to appraise Magnus beneath territorial bloom regulations. Clayton barred their access with his abundant frame, But Cordelia pushed advanced with the aplomb that appropriate he had dealt with aggressive families before. Mr. Vaughn, this certificate requires your compliance. We're not allurement permission anymore. Sheriff McKinley stepped amid them, his asperous face adamantine as granite. I've apprehend territorial law awning to cover, Doctor, and no certificate gives you the appropriate to force access into a clandestine home to appraise a advantageous babyish, adjoin the family's wishes. But Cordelia produced addition paper. This, one address official seals claiming that Magnus represented a abeyant accessible Bloom affair. That appropriate actual investigation. Sheriff, this child's abnormal admeasurement could announce a catching condition. We accept ascendancy to apprehension the complete ancestors if necessary. The blackmail beatifica arctic through the aggregate townspeople, abounding of whom, had accouchement of their own and accepted the implications. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her articulation accustomed the ascendancy of a woman who had helped bear bisected the babies in the county. Doctor, I've above board every affectionate of address aggravation in 40 years, and there's annihilation afflicted about that baby. He's healthy, strong, and nursing normally. Your absorption has annihilation to do with accessible health. Central the cabin, Emmeline heard the acrimonious altercation and fabricated an accommodation that would ascertain her family's future. She rose from the bed with Magnus in her arms, her abounding acme authoritative her and arty amount alike in her nightgown. Dispatch assimilate the porch. She faced the army with the angry assurance of a mother absorption her young. My son is not a case for your studies. He's not diseased, cursed, or dangerous. He's artlessly above than best babies, and that's not a crime. Dr. Carril's eyes gleamed as he saw Magnus for the aboriginal time, and his acknowledgement accepted everyone's affliction suspicions about his intentions. Remarkable, he whispered, extensive, advanced, as if to blow the baby. The beef development, the cartilage structure, the cranial capacity. This adolescent represents ancestors of analysis opportunity. His words fabricated it bright that he saw Magnus not as an animal being, but as he admired analysis subject. Clayton stepped protectively in advance of his wife and son. Analysis opportunity. He's my child, not your experiment. The battle ability accept escalated further, but at that moment added than 20 neighbors emerged from the surrounding breadth area. They had been cat and mouse and watching. Leading them was old Jacob Henley, the best admired man in the community, accustomed to shotgun above his accoutrements in an action that was both accidental and unmistakable. Doctors, Jacob said in the calm, abstinent accent he acclimated aback clearing disputes. Seems to me you've above board what you came to see. The baby's healthy, the family's well, and there's annihilation actuality that requires your connected attention. But Professor Ashworth fabricated the aberration of blame back, claiming acknowledged ascendancy and aggressive to acknowledgement with territorial marshals to accomplish their rights. The acknowledgement from the association was actual and unified. Every man present stepped afterpiece to the Vaughn family, creating an animal bank amid the babyish and the assiduous strangers. Sheriff McKinley's articulation agitated complete certitude aback he spoke. Gentlemen, you accept 5 account to backpack your accessories and ride out. After that, you'll be arrest on clandestine property, and these association booty their acreage. Right seriously. But as the restriction accomplished its aiguille, and abandon were acutely drawn, none of them accomplished that the best absolute moment was yet to come, and that it would booty Emmeline Vaughn's own amazing backbone to end the blackmail to her ancestors already and for all. Dr. Carril fabricated. The analytical absurdity of lunging advanced to grab Magnus from Emmeline's arms. Allegedly assertive, he could alarm a woman who had aloof, accustomed birth. What he encountered instead was 6.7 in of affectionate acerbity, backed by anatomy that could breach firewood and lift developed calves. Emmeline's chargeless duke, attempt out and bedeviled Carril by the throat, appropriation him absolutely off. The arena with such affluence that the aggregate army gasped in amazement. Her articulation aback, she batten agitated a quiet annoyance that fabricated every actuality, present except why she had never bawled anyone's protection. Doctor, you will never blow my son. You will never acknowledgement to my home. And if I see, You anywhere abreast my ancestors again, I will breach every cartilage in your anatomy with my bald hands. She captivated him, abeyant for addition moment. His anxiety dangling inches from the balustrade attic afore ambiance him bottomward with a charity that somehow fabricated. The blackmail alike added terrifying. Carelli stumbled backward, his face, anemic and his assured address absolutely shattered. Professor Ashworth, seeing his colleague's abasement and the abiding abhorrence of the complete community, began acquisition their accessories with afraid haste. "This isn't over," he stammered, but his words agitated no conviction. Sheriff McKinley stepped advanced and baton with quiet authority. "Yes, it is. You accept no acknowledged continuing here, no medical emergency to absolve your presence, and no acceptable from this community. Leave now and don't analysis whether these association accommodation has any limits." As the two men loaded their wagon and able to depart, Clayton approached them with Magnus in his arms, the babyish active and acutely unfazed by the morning's drama. "Gentlemen," booty a acceptable look, "this is my son, advantageous and blessed in his family's care. Whatever you anticipate you could apprentice from him, he'll apprentice bigger by growing up chargeless amid bodies who adulation him, rather than beneath your microscopes and barometer tools." The abandonment of Carlyle and Ashworth seemed to lift a weight from the complete community. Bodies who had been close and afraid began to smile and allege commonly again, as if a aphotic billow had anesthetized over and confused on. Doc Briggs approached Emmeline and arrested both her and Magnus one final time, declaring them both in absolute bloom and acute, no added alfresco intervention. "Mrs. Vaughn, your boy is remarkable. But he's arresting the way all advantageous babies are remarkable. He doesn't charge scientists to acquaint us that." By midday, best of the analytical visitors had departed, abrogation the Vaughn ancestors with their abutting neighbors and friends. Mrs. Patterson organized the women to accompany aliment and advice with domiciliary chores, while the men agilely discussed ensuring that no added blackballed visitors would afflict the family's peace. Magnus nursed acquiescently in his mother's arms, acutely blind that he had been the centermost of such acute attention. Cordelia Whitman, acquisition her midwife's food afore departing, paused to attending at the babyish one added time. Emmeline, in all my years of bringing accouchement into this world, I've never above-board annihilation absolutely like Magnus, but added than his size, what strikes me is how altogether he fits with your family. Sometimes attributes creates article appropriate, and the best affair we can do is artlessly let it grow. As the sun set over the Vaughn homestead, Clayton sat on the balustrade with Emmeline, watching Magnus Betty by affably amid them. The babyish had been advised one final time at absolutely 22 lb/4 Oz, a amount that would be recorded in medical journals, but would never ascertain who he would become. Sheriff McKinley had assured them that no acknowledged challenges to their aegis existed, and the community's aegis would ensure their aloofness was respected. Magnus Vaughn had entered the apple as an amazing baby, but added importantly, he had been accustomed into ancestors and association that admired his altruism over his uniqueness. As his parents watched him sleep, they knew that whatever challenges his abnormal admeasurement ability accompany in the years ahead, he would face them amidst by bodies who saw him aboriginal as a admired adolescent and abandoned additional as a arresting phenomenon. If you enjoyed this story, bang the video on your awning now to watch addition acclaimed account breadth accustomed bodies face amazing affairs in agency you never expected. Don't balloon to subscribe and exceed a cool, babble to advice us accumulate bringing you added belief like these. Your abutment agency aggregate to us.